Here's Frank Turek's goofy attempt to argue that the Bible is reliable.
How do you account for the errors of the scribes when the New Testament was handed down person to person?
Yeah, excellent question. There are errors that we know about. Why? Because we can compare the documents, we can compare the manuscripts and see where the errors are. In fact, let me see if I can show you a representation of that, because it's better seen than it is described. Here it is. Let's say you have, here's the original, which we don't have. We don't, at least we don't think we have any original documents, okay? So they're all copies, okay? And let's say you find 4 different copies. And in the first copy, you see an error right here. And then another copy, there's another error right there. In the third copy, there's another error right there. And in the fourth copy, there's an error right there. Can you reconstruct the original?
Only if we assume that all the copies are not repeating the same error. Wide consistencies may be more likely to have been in the original, but we can't know for sure that they are in the original. And we have textual variants with not just tiny typographical errors, which is what Turek's illustration seems to portray, but whole passages that don't appear in any copies until over 100 years after the earliest copies were written.
Yes, and that's what scholars do. The original, this happens to be Romans 3:26, God is just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Now the note here is the New Testament documents have far fewer variations than this example. So yes, sometimes scribe made mistakes, but in virtually all cases we know what the mistake was and we can correct it by comparing it with other documents. Now you might say, why wouldn't God just, if this is true, why wouldn't he just maintain the original? I'm speculating here, but I think one reason, well, 2 reasons. Number one, if we had the original, we might venerate it. We tend to venerate things like that, right?
Why would that be a problem? If the original is really the infallible word of your God, why wouldn't you venerate it?
But number 2, if I had the original, what could I do to it? I could alter it, right?
Right, so how do you know that it hadn't already been altered? If it ever existed at all, alteration was a possibility. How do you know these copies are not copies of an altered original?
But if you had a copy, 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 and I had a copy, and I changed my copy, is everyone going to know who changed their copy? Yeah, because when you get all your copies together and compare it to mine, you go, Turek, you heretic, why'd you do that? Right? So by not preserving the original, you actually are able to preserve the original better.
Not if they are not only copies, but copies of copies, or copies of copies of copies, which is likely the case with biblical documents. Unless we know the provenance of not only each copy, but also each copy from which each subsequent copy was made, there's no way to know where an inconsistency originated. Even if everyone had an identical copy to everyone else's, if they were all copied from an alteration, then you're all walking around with forgeries.
So what if the error is not that simple? Like, what if it's a difference in concept? So if we have these copies and say copy 1 gets 12 copies, copy 2 gets 24 copies, and then you've got copy 4 that gets 400 copies, but copy 4 is the incorrect copy, then how do we justify truth in that? As well as how do we justify the truth in Jesus' exact words when we didn't hear them ourselves?
Okay, there is no significant doctrine, theological doctrine, that is affected by any variant. And who admits this? Bart Ehrman himself. Okay? So Bart Ehrman, the great skeptic, admits that the New Testament documents are reliable.
Well, no. Saying that there are no significant doctrinal issues is not the same as saying that the documents are reliable. The fact that the copies we currently have are largely doctrinally consistent with each other does not mean that they are doctrinally consistent with the original. We don't know for sure what the original said.
In fact, let me show you a quote from him, because this quote is very right on the money. You know, he wrote the book Misquoting Jesus. I don't know if you've heard of this book, but in 2005 he wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus, a popular book in which he tries to insinuate that we can't trust what the New Testament documents have said.
That's right. To say that the copies we have are doctrinally consistent with each other is not a guarantee that they are doctrinally consistent with the original.
Yet the very same year, 2005, he wrote an academic work. He updated an academic work with his mentor, Dr. Bruce Metzger from Princeton University. In fact, Metzger was the top manuscript scholar of the last century. And in that book, he agrees with Metzger that the New Testament documents are copied accurately.
Well, here's what Ehrman said on his blog in 2014. Metzger, of course, realized that there are hundreds of thousands of textual variants in our manuscript tradition of the New Testament. He also knew that the vast majority of them were minor, insignificant, and of virtually no importance. He also recognized that some of the others are very important and have a real effect on the meaning of the text. But he thought that at the end of the day, we can be reasonably confident of something like 99% of the text of the New Testament. Ehrman apparently doesn't think we can be confident about that high a percentage. Here's Ehrman's opinion on the matter. It's true that we have early papyrus manuscripts, but these are highly fragmentary indeed. We do not get large chunks of texts until some papyri of around 200 CE. These too are still highly fragmentary. That means the text was being copied for over 100 years before we start getting full chapters of any of it preserved. Our first complete copies of any of the books come from 150 years after that, around the middle of the 4th century. I simply don't see how we can know what changes were made in the first month or two, or the first year or two, or the first decade or two of the text if we don't have any manuscripts from that time, or in fact any manuscripts with those passages for another 300 years. This did not bother Metzger so much because at the end of the day he had faith that the manuscripts we do have are accurate representations of the original text. But that really is a matter of faith, not logic or evidence.
Now, why is he coming to two different conclusions the same year? Same evidence. The only thing I can speculate is when you say to the academic community something wrong, they'll correct you on it. But when you say something wrong to the lay community, they don't know any better.
First of all, he's not coming to different conclusions. Secondly, Turek is smearing Ehrman by implying that he is lying for money.
But this one, now here's what he says. This is in the appendix of the paperback version. So this comes out a year or two later from the original Misquoting Jesus. He's interviewed. And in the interview, here's what he says. Check this out. This is a quote from the book, page 252. He says, Bruce Metzger is one of the great scholars of modern times, and I dedicated the book to him because he was both my inspiration for going into textual criticism and the person who trained me in the field. I have nothing but respect and admiration for him, and even though we may disagree on important religious questions, he is a firmly committed Christian and I am not. We are in complete agreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions. What are they in agreement on? If he and I were put into a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement, maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. The position I argue for in Misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament.
While those disagreements may not be about what the original probably looked like, where they seem to disagree is on exactly how probably accurate they are. Metzger seems to think that they are a lot more probably accurate than Ehrman does. How is Ehrman coming to two different conclusions in Misquoting Jesus and the later work he authored with Metzger, if Misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position, and the later work he authored with Metzger is also not at odds with that position?
Well, why would you write Misquoting Jesus then?
Because there are lots of folks in the lay audience who think every jot and tittle of the Bible is something we know for certain came straight from Yahweh himself. Even Bart Ehrman believed that the Bible was far more consistent than he later discovered it to be. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.